A jaguar moves through a stone plaza where kings once stood. Its paws fall silently on steps carved for gods, steps that no human foot has climbed in over 1,000 years. Above, a temple pierces the canopy, 150 feet of limestone reaching toward a sky it was built to read. Roots split its walls apart. Vines have swallowed its face. And somewhere beneath the leaf litter, tens of thousands of people who once filled this city with music, trade, and prayer simply vanished from the record of history. This is not the ruin of a forgotten village. This, Tikal. At its height, it was home to more people than medieval London. Its astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with precision that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Its scribes recorded dynasties stretching back generations. Its markets moved jade, cacao, and obsidian across hundreds of miles of jungle and coast. And then, within the span of a single human lifetime, it stopped. Not just Tikal. Across the lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, dozens of great Maya cities fell into the same silence. Copan, Calakmul, cities that had stood for 600 years, that had outlasted Rome's rise and Rome's fall, went dark almost in unison. The stone calendars stopped being carved. The temples stopped being expanded. The kings stopped being named. And the jungle, patient as it always is, began to take back what had been built. For centuries afterward, when Spanish explorers hacked their way through the undergrowth of Central America, they found these cities and simply could not believe local people had built them. They imagined lost Egyptians, wandering Israelites, even refugees from Atlantis. The truth, as it turns out, needed no outside explanation. It needed something far more unsettling. It needed us to understand how a civilization at the height of its power could undo itself from the inside. To understand the fall, you first have to understand what was being lost. The Maya were never a single empire the way Rome or Egypt were. They were a constellation of city-states, each with its own king, its own gods, its own rivalries and alliances, bound together by a shared language family, a shared writing system, and a shared way of reading the sky. Their calendar was so precise that some of their astronomical calculations remain accurate today. Their writing system, once dismissed by colonial scholars as decorative nonsense, has now been largely deciphered, and it tells us this was a civilization obsessed with history. They carved the names of their kings. They recorded wars, marriages, droughts, and eclipses. They wanted to be remembered. By the year 250 of the Common Era, what archaeologists call the Classic Period was underway, and it would last nearly 600 years. Cities grew immense. Tikal alone may have supported over 60,000 people, with the wider region around it holding many times more. These were not primitive settlements scattered through the trees. They were engineered landscapes, with reservoirs to capture rainfall, raised fields to grow maize in swampland, causeways connecting temple to temple, and irrigation systems built centuries before European cities would attempt anything similar. And then, starting around the 8th century, something began to change. It did not happen everywhere at once. That is one of the strangest parts of this story. The collapse moved like a slow wave across the southern lowlands, city by city, decade by decade. One dynasty would simply stop recording its history. A neighboring city might carry on for another 50 years before it fell silent. Researchers believe the process unfolded over roughly a century, between 800 and 900 CE, though some cities in the northern Yucatan, like Chichen Itza, continued to thrive for centuries afterward. This was not a single catastrophic event. It was closer to a slow-motion unraveling, and that makes it both harder to explain and far more chilling. So, actually happened. For decades, this question sat at the center of Maya archaeology, and it has produced one of the most fascinating detective stories in modern science. There is no single confirmed answer, but the evidence that has accumulated, layer by layer, points towards several forces converging at once, each one making the others worse. The first thread researchers began pulling on was climate. Deep within lake beds and cave formations across the Yucatan Peninsula, scientists have extracted cores of and stalagmites that function almost like tree rings, recording centuries of rainfall in their mineral layers. What they found? Striking. The period leading up to the collapse coincided with a series of severe droughts, some of the worst the region had experienced in thousands of years. According to some estimates drawn from these climate records, rainfall may have dropped by as much as 40 to 50% during the driest intervals compared to earlier centuries. For a civilization that depended almost entirely on seasonal rain to grow maize, a crop with no natural resistance to prolonged dry spells, this was catastrophic. The Maya had built sophisticated systems to capture and store water, some reservoirs holding hundreds of millions of gallons. But those systems were designed for the droughts their ancestors had known, not for something unprecedented. Current research indicates that when the rain simply did not come year after year, even the most advanced water management could not compensate. But drought alone does not explain everything, and researchers are careful not to present it as the whole story. Because the drought did not strike a civilization living in balance with its environment. It struck a civilization that had already pushed its landscape to the edge. By the 8th century, Maya cities were suffering under their own success. Population had grown so large that farmers had cleared vast stretches of tropical forest to make room for fields, cutting down trees that had once helped regulate local rainfall and stabilize the soil. Sediment records show alarm rates of erosion during this period, as denuded hillsides washed away with each storm, silting up reservoirs and rivers that communities depended on. Some historians suggest that this deforestation may have actually worsened the droughts themselves, since large-scale forest loss can reduce a region's capacity to generate rainfall. If that theory holds, the Maya may have inadvertently contributed to the very climate crisis that helped destroy them, a sobering thought for any civilization that assumes its landscape can be endlessly reshaped without consequence. Layered on top of environmental strain was a political structure that, for all its cultural brilliance, may have been fundamentally unstable. Unlike a centralized empire, the Maya world was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, and as resources grew scarce, competition between them appears to have intensified rather than eased. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a marked increase in fortifications, defensive walls hastily built around city centers, and inscriptions boasting of military victories over rival dynasties. Some cities record the capture and, according to their own hieroglyphic texts, the ritual execution of enemy kings. According to archaeological evidence uncovered at sites like Dos Pilas, warfare during the final century of the Classic period was not the ceremonial, limited conflict some earlier scholars had imagined. It was often devastating, involving the destruction of monuments, the burning of palaces, and the displacement of entire populations. One interpretation, now widely accepted among Maya scholars, is that as farmland failed and food grew scarce, Kings who could no longer guarantee prosperity for their people lost their legitimacy, and desperate states turned on their neighbors in a spiral of conflict that further disrupted trade, agriculture, and the fragile networks holding the region together. And there is a third thread, one that reveals something almost uncomfortably familiar. The Maya kings derived much of their authority from a claim that most people today would find extraordinary. They presented themselves as intermediaries between their people and the gods, particularly the gods of rain and fertility. Temple inscriptions and royal iconography repeatedly link kingship to the ability to ensure good harvests through ritual and divine favor. When the rains failed, despite ceremony after ceremony, despite the enormous resources poured into temples built specifically to petition the gods for water, that sacred bargain began to break down. Researchers believe this erosion of trust in the ruling class may have been as significant as the drought itself. If your king's entire claim to power rests on his ability to bring rain, and the rain stops coming for years on end, what happens to the authority of kings? Some archaeologists point to evidence that in several cities, the last several decades before abandonment show a collapse not just in population, but in the very practice of erecting royal monuments, as though the institution of kingship itself had lost its meaning to the people it once commanded. Picture what this convergence would have felt like on the ground, not as statistics in a research paper, but as lived experience. Fields that had fed families for generations producing less each season, reservoirs shrinking toward mud, a king's temple ceremonies failing, visibly, publicly, year after year, to bring relief, neighboring cities raiding for the last of the available farmland. And slowly, the reason to stay, the reason to maintain a 200-foot pyramid, the reason to carve another stone recording a king's glory, dissolving into the more urgent question of where the next meal would come from. The evidence suggests that people did not vanish. That is one of the most important corrections modern archaeology has made to the popular imagination of this story. The Maya did not disappear. Millions of their descendants live across the region today, speaking Maya languages, practicing traditions with roots stretching back thousands of years. What collapsed? Not a people. It was a particular political and religious system, an elaborate structure of divine kingship and monumental city building that had thrived for 6 centuries, and then, under mounting pressure, came apart. As the great southern cities emptied, refugees are believed to have moved north and east into the Yucatan, where cities like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan absorbed new populations and built new political structures, less centered on god-kings, more oriented toward councils and trade. In a sense, the Maya world did not end in the 9th century. But for the magnificent cities of the southern lowlands, for Tikal and Calakmul and Palenque, the transformation looked like abandonment, and the jungle moved in to claim what people left behind. What makes this story resonate so powerfully today is not simply the mystery of it, but the mirror it holds up. Here was a civilization that had mastered astronomy precise enough to predict eclipses, that had engineered water systems more advanced than most of medieval Europe, that had built cities of staggering scale and sophistication using nothing but stone tools and human labor. And still, the combination of environmental strain, political fragmentation, and a crisis of institutional trust prove that even that brilliance could withstand. The evidence remains debated, and Maya scholars continue to argue over exactly how much weight to assign to drought versus warfare versus internal political failure. New research using isotope analysis, LiDAR mapping of hidden cities beneath the jungle canopy, and increasingly reclined climate hoods continues to reshape the picture year by year. What once looked like a single cause is now understood as a cascade, environmental pressure feeding political instability undermining the religious authority holding society together, each crisis defying the next until the entire system could no longer hold its own weight. Perhaps it is the real reason this story has never lost its grip on our imagination. It is not really about a lost civilization in the jungle at all. It is about the fragility hidden inside every system that looks, from the outside, unshakable. The Maya did not fall because they were unsophisticated or unprepared. They fell because even sophistication has limits when the climate turns, when leaders can no longer deliver on their promises, and when the pressures on a society converge faster than that society can adapt. Somewhere in the Guatemalan jungle right now, the temples of Tikal are still standing, still being slowly reclaimed by roots and rain. Researchers are still pulling sediment cores from lake beds, still deciphering broken inscriptions, still trying to reconstruct the final years of dynasties that once ruled an empire of stone and sky. Every new discovery adds a little more detail, but the full picture may never be complete. So the question worth sitting with is not simply why the Maya cities fell silent. It is this: when a society today faces its own convergence of pressures, environmental, political, and social, all arriving at once, what would it take for us to recognize the warning signs before the silence sets in? What do you think finally tipped the balance for the Maya, and do you see anything of that pattern in the world around us now?